I didn't know my marriage was about to end because of a name I had heard too many times to ever take seriously. For 11 years, I believed my life was solid, predictable, built on trust so familiar it felt permanent. I was 33, married, living in the house my husband and I had bought together with the kind of optimism people only have when they believe betrayal is something that happens to other couples. I didn't know that all of it, our routines, our plans to start a family, the quiet certainty I carried about who I was to him, would collapse because of a single confession delivered through tears on a Sunday evening. I didn't know that the man he would cheat on me with was someone who had wanted him since high school. Someone I had met, someone I had spoken to casually at birthday parties and family gatherings, someone I had never once considered a threat. That's the part that still makes my chest tighten. When my husband Daniel walked back into our house that evening, he looked like a stranger wearing my husband's face. His eyes were red, his clothes were wrinkled. There was a kind of guilt clinging to him, thick, almost visible, that made the air in our living room feel unbreathable. I remember sitting beside him on the couch, my hands folded so tightly in my lap, my fingers ached. I remember thinking he was about to tell me someone had died. Instead, he told me our marriage had. He said it in pieces, broken sentences, long silences. A name dropped like it meant nothing. Jaden, a name I associated with awkward smiles and harmless conversations, a name I associated with the past, not with my present, certainly not with my bed. When the truth finally landed, it didn't explode. It hollowed me out. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't cry at first. I stood up, walked out of the room, grabbed my keys, and drove until I couldn't remember where I was going. Because in that moment, I realized something far worse than infidelity had happened. The man I trusted most in the world didn't just cheat. He shattered the future I was still standing inside, without even asking if I was ready to let it go. And I had no idea that what came next would be even more humiliating than the betrayal itself. Before everything blew apart, I would have described my marriage as easy. Not perfect in a fairy tale way, more like the kind of steady, grown-up love people build when they've survived enough life to stop chasing drama. My name is Aubrey. I was 33, working in marketing, the type of job where your brain never truly clocks out. Campaigns, deadlines, client calls, that always seemed to just take 5 minutes and somehow swallowed entire evenings. My husband, Daniel, was 34 and worked in IT. The kind of person who could stare at a problem for hours, quiet and focused, and then solve it in a way that felt almost unfairly calm. We balanced each other. I used to say he was my anchor, and he joked that I was his spark. We rarely fought about anything big. Our arguments were the normal kind. Household chores, whose turn it was to grocery shop, whether we really needed another streaming subscription. Small things that felt almost comforting because they proved we were real. 3 years ago, we bought our first house together. A modest place, but it was ours. White siding, a backyard big enough for a future dog, and a kitchen we swore we'd renovate someday. We talked about starting a family the next year. Not in the vague way people say it to sound serious. Daniel and I had actual conversations. Timing, finances. The way I wanted to be mentally ready before pregnancy turned my life inside out. The way he wanted to be the kind of dad who didn't just help, but showed up fully. That's what made the betrayal so confusing afterward, because nothing in our everyday life looked broken. I grew up in a small town about 2 hours away from where Daniel and I lived. It was the kind of place where everyone still knows everyone, where high school friendships linger like old songs you can't fully forget. Most of my childhood friends still lived there, or close enough that they treated distance like it was nothing. My closest friend from those years was Everly. We'd known each other since middle school. Everly was loud where I was cautious, blunt where I was diplomatic. She was the type who would tell you the truth even if it stung, and she'd do it while holding your hand so you couldn't pretend she was being cruel. Everly had a younger brother named Jaden. He was 5 years younger than me. I didn't grow up with him the way I grew up with Everly. He was just there, sometimes in the background of photos, sometimes popping up at gatherings. A familiar face that never felt important. The first time Daniel met Jaden was at Everly's birthday party 8 years ago, back when Daniel and I had only been dating for a short while. I remember that night clearly because it was one of the first times I thought, maybe this relationship is really going somewhere. Daniel was charming in that effortless way he had, talking to Everly's parents, offering to help carry things, making my friends laugh without trying too hard. It made me proud. It made me feel safe. Jaden was polite. He shook Daniel's hand, smiled, asked him what he did for work. Normal. But I noticed something that night, something I brushed off at the time because it felt too small to matter. Jaden kept trying to talk to me. Not in an overt way, not in a flirtatious way that would have made me step back. More like he was hovering, looking for moments when Daniel got pulled into another conversation so Jaden could slide closer and ask me questions. How's work? How's life in the city? Do you ever come back home? Later, Everly pulled me aside with a grin and said, like it was an old joke, "You know he had the biggest crush on you in high school, right?" I laughed. I remember shrugging and saying something like, "That was forever ago." Everly told Daniel too, almost teasingly, how Jaden had asked me to prom once and I'd turned him down because I wasn't interested. Daniel laughed with us. He wasn't threatened. Why would he be? And honestly, neither was I. By the time Daniel and I got married, Jaden seemed to have moved on. He dated other women. He had a job as a mechanic. He lived in an apartment near Everly. When we saw him at gatherings, he was friendly. He'd talk to Daniel about cars or sports like they were just two guys making polite conversation. I never thought much about him. That's the part that haunts me now. Because the truth is, when you trust your husband completely, you stop imagining danger in the places you've labeled safe. And I had labeled Jaden as harmless a long time ago. If I'm being honest with myself now, the signs didn't start with the betrayal. They started with distance. 6 weeks before everything fell apart, my husband told me he was going back to his hometown for a long weekend. His mother had been dealing with some ongoing health issues, not life-threatening, but exhausting, and he said she needed help organizing paperwork and clearing out a storage room that had been overwhelming her for months. It wasn't unusual. We'd done this before. Sometimes I visited my parents alone, sometimes he visited his. That's what long marriages looked like: flexibility, understanding, trust. I had a major project deadline that Monday, a client campaign that had already eaten through 2 weeks of my life. So I stayed behind without a second thought. The night before he left, we had a small argument. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you replay later and think, that's where everything went wrong. It was about the kitchen. Dishes in the sink for 2 days. I'd been meaning to clean them, but work had drained every ounce of patience I had left. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, tired in that quiet way that feels heavier than yelling. "You said you'd take care of it," he said. "I will," I replied, sharper than I meant to. "It's just plates." He sighed, grabbed his keys, and said, "I don't want to come back to a mess." I remember watching him walk out and thinking, why are we snapping at each other over nothing? Before he drove off, I kissed him. A normal kiss. Familiar. Safe. That night I texted him, "I'll clean the kitchen. Drive safe." He replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was the first moment that felt off. We didn't text much on Saturday. I told myself he was busy with his parents, that he was tired, that not every silence needed meaning. Saturday night, around 11, my phone buzzed. He texted that he was going out to a bar with Everly and another friend, Bennett. I told him to have fun. I meant it. I went to bed just after midnight, the TV still glowing softly in the background. At 8 Sunday morning, my phone was vibrating in my hand before I was fully awake. A missed call. Timestamp 5:02 a.m. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like I'd fallen through the bed. He never called that late unless something was wrong. I called him back immediately. No answer. I called again. And again. I sent texts, short at first, then longer, my fingers clumsy with panic. "Are you okay? Please call me. I'm worried." An hour passed, then 2. At 10 o'clock, a message finally came through. "I'm fine. I'll be home later today." That was it. No explanation for the call. No apology. No reassurance. I stared at my phone like it had personally betrayed me. When I asked if everything was really okay, he replied, "We'll talk when I get home." I spent the rest of the morning cleaning the house like it was something I could control, scrubbing counters too hard, folding laundry I didn't remember washing. The feeling in my chest wouldn't settle. It wasn't fear yet. It was something quieter and more insidious. Dread. He got home around 5 that evening. I opened the door and felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. He looked wrecked. Red, swollen eyes. No makeup. Something he always wore, even minimally, when he went out. He was wearing the same clothes from the night before. His hair was tangled, his posture collapsed inward like gravity had suddenly doubled. He didn't hug me. He didn't even look at me. He walked straight past me and sat down on the couch, staring at the floor like it might open up and swallow him. I followed him, my heart pounding in my ears. "What happened?" I asked. He didn't answer. I made him tea. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly spilled it. I sat beside him and rested my hand on his shoulder. "You can tell me," I said quietly. That's when he started crying. Not gentle tears, not quiet ones. These were choking sobs, ragged, desperate, like his body was trying to expel something poisonous. I sat there, frozen, waiting for the words that would explain everything. I had no idea that when they finally came, they would split my life cleanly in two. When he finally spoke, it was like listening to glass shatter in slow motion. "I slept with someone." The sentence didn't register at first. It hovered between us, incomplete, waiting for context that never came. My brain searched for alternatives. Misheard, misunderstood, misspoke. "Who?" I asked, my voice too calm to belong to me. He didn't answer right away. His hands were clenched together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He stared at them like they might tell him what to do next. "It happened after the bar," he said finally. Who?" I repeated. This time it came out harder. He swallowed. "Jaden." Everything inside me went quiet. Not loud, not explosive, just blank. I stood up so suddenly the coffee table rattled. The room felt unreal, like I was watching myself from somewhere near the ceiling. I didn't yell. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I walked out. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and left the house without saying another word. I don't remember buckling my seatbelt. I don't remember which turns I took. I drove until the neighborhood disappeared and parked it near a small park about 20 minutes away. I got out of the car and walked, in circles, over and over. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my pocket, his name flashing on the screen like a taunt. After the 5th call, I turned it off. I remember thinking, if I stay in this car, I might do something reckless. So I walked until my legs ached, until my thoughts slowed enough that I could breathe again. 2 hours later, I drove home. When I walked through the door, he was still there, curled up on the floor like a child who'd been punished and didn't understand why. I didn't look at his face. I went straight to the garage and pulled out the 2 large duffel bags we use for camping trips. I started packing. Not carefully, not logically. I grabbed armfuls of clothes from his closet, yanked open drawers, shoved shoes in without pairing them. The sound of zippers felt violent. Final. I dragged the bags to the front door and went back into the living room. He looked up at me then, eyes wild with panic. "Please," he said, "please don't do this." I picked up my phone and called Everly. "She needs somewhere to stay," I said flatly when she answered. "Can you come get him?" Everly started asking questions, her voice sharp with concern, but I cut her off. "Ask him," I said, and hung up. I told my husband that Everly was on her way and that I was leaving again. He crawled toward me on his knees and grabbed my legs, clutching at me like I was something he could still keep. "I'll do anything," he sobbed. "Anything, please." I pulled away. I didn't say goodbye. I drove aimlessly for another hour, sitting in a grocery store parking lot until I was sure enough time had passed. When I came back, the house was empty. The duffel bags were gone. So was he. The silence that followed was suffocating. I went into our bedroom and lay down on the bed, our bed, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion dragged me into sleep. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My phone was filled with missed calls and messages, dozens of them. I didn't read a single one. Around noon, I finally answered when he called again. He started apologizing immediately, crying, begging. I cut him off. "I want you to write down everything that happened that night," I said, "in an email, every detail. If you leave anything out, we're done, completely." He agreed without hesitation. I hung up. The email came that night around 9. I saw it sitting in my inbox, unread. I didn't open it. I wasn't ready to see the words that would make what happened permanent. The days that followed blurred together. I went to work. I went to the gym. I ran until my legs burned, until the anger had somewhere to go. I barely slept. I ate whatever was easiest to swallow. Friends reached out. I blocked them. One of them showed up at the house, demanding to know what I had done to my husband. I told her to talk to him and closed the door. On Thursday, a note appeared under the front door. "Can we talk Friday night, please?" I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it away either. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, asking myself if hearing him out would help, or just reopen a wound that hadn't even started to heal. By Friday morning, I texted him. 7 at the house. He replied immediately. The clock ticked towards 7, like it was counting down something irreversible. I had no idea that the truth I was about to hear would make the betrayal feel even worse. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I had already cleaned the living room twice, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something to do. I set my phone on the kitchen counter, screen down, recording audio. I didn't tell myself why I did it. I just knew I needed proof of this moment, something solid in case my memory tried to soften it later. When I opened the door, I barely recognized my husband. He looked smaller somehow, thinner. His face was hollowed out, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes. The confidence I'd known for over a decade was gone, replaced by a fragile desperation that made my chest tighten, not with pity, but with a strange, distant sadness. He tried to step forward and hug me. I stepped back. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling deliberate, necessary. When I told him I was recording, he nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to stop. "I haven't read your email," I said. His eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he stayed quiet. "Tell me what happened," I said, "from the beginning." He took a deep breath, then another. He told me about the bar, about Everly and Bennett, about having a few drinks, not drunk, just buzzed. He said around midnight, Everly texted Jaden to come pick them up so no one had to drive. They went to a diner. They ate. They laughed. He said Jaden dropped Bennett off first, then Everly. Then it was just the two of them. He said Jaden asked if he wanted to come up to his apartment for a bit instead of driving all the way back to his parents' house. Said it was late. Said he didn't want to inconvenience him. He said he agreed. That was the first moment something inside me shifted. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. He told me they went up to Jaden's apartment, that he tried to call a cab but couldn't get one quickly, that Jaden offered him the bed and said he'd take the couch, that they were sitting on the bed, looking at his phone. Then he said Jaden kissed him, and he kissed him back. "And then?" I asked. He hesitated. "Then we had sex." I felt it then, not pain exactly, more like pressure, like something heavy had been placed directly on my chest. He said afterward, he started crying, that Jaden drove him to his parents' house, that he cried in his childhood bedroom for an hour before calling me. I sat there listening, nodding occasionally like I was taking notes for a meeting I didn't want to attend. The story didn't make sense. Why go up to the apartment at all? Why sit on the bed? Why agree to any of it? But I didn't ask, because somewhere deep down I already knew the answers wouldn't matter. When he finished, he looked at me like he was waiting for a verdict. I stood up. "I'm moving forward with the divorce," I said. He broke down again, crying, begging, promising. He said he'd do anything. Therapy, transparency, whatever I needed. I told him I wanted a month of no contact, no calls, no texts, no checking in. "I need space to think without you in my head," I said. "And during that month, we stay faithful. We both get tested." He agreed immediately, too quickly. I also told him he needed to tell our friends and family what he did. He nodded again. No resistance. When he left, I sat alone on the couch for a long time, staring at the wall like it might tell me how my life had turned into this. The first week after that meeting was brutal. I functioned on autopilot. Work, gym, sleep, if you could call it that. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I replayed conversations, moments, memories I had once labeled safe. Friends reached out. Some were supportive. A few tried to soften what he did. "People make mistakes," they said. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just let the silence speak for me. His parents called one night. They apologized. They asked me to consider forgiveness. They said they understood if I couldn't. I said I hadn't decided yet. 10 days after our meeting, I finally opened the email. It was a mistake. It was detailed, painfully so, explicit in ways I didn't need. He wrote about what they did, how long it lasted, and that they used protection. I felt sick reading it. But what stopped me cold wasn't what was written. It was what wasn't. There was no mention of trying to get a cab, no hesitation, no resistance. Just an invitation. And acceptance. I closed the email and didn't reopen it. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not rage, not grief, but clarity. Because if he could lie to my face once, he could do it again. And I knew, with terrifying certainty, that trust, once fractured that deeply, doesn't heal the way people pretend it does. It shatters. Quietly. Permanently. The second week of no contact didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and with it, a deeper kind of pain. Once the shock wore off, my mind started doing something far more dangerous than panicking. It began connecting dots. I started looking at everything with new eyes. Old conversations, casual mentions, the way certain names appeared more often than they should have, the way I had trusted so completely that I never thought to question context. I moved money out of our joint account into a new one under my name. Not to punish him, but to protect myself. I documented everything: mortgage payments, shared expenses, emails, messages. I scheduled consultations with 3 different divorce lawyers, not because I was eager, but because I needed to understand what reality looked like if I stepped fully into it. That's when Bennett reached out. She sent a message that was careful, hesitant, like she didn't want to overstep. "I feel awful about what happened," she wrote. "If you ever want to hear my side of that night, I'll tell you." I agreed to meet her for coffee. She looked nervous when she arrived, hands wrapped tightly around her cup. She confirmed most of what my husband had told me: the bar, the drinks, the diner. But when I asked about the ride home, her expression changed. "Jaden dropped Everly and me off first," she said slowly. "Before I got out, I offered for him to stay at my place since it was late." I felt my spine stiffen. "What did he say?" I asked. He said no, that he was fine. No mention of needing a cab, no urgency to get home. Bennett said she assumed Jaden was driving him straight to his parents' house. She didn't hear anything about staying at an apartment. That night, I reached out to Everly. She called me back within minutes. We talked for over an hour. She was furious, with both of them. She told me Jaden had been obsessed with my husband for years, that she'd warned him repeatedly to move on, that she truly didn't believe anything had happened between them before that night, but then she hesitated. "There was something weird," she said, "about 8 months ago." She told me she'd gone to meet my husband for lunch at a cafe. When she arrived, Jaden was already there, sitting at the table. "He said they'd run into each other," Everly said, "but he looked uncomfortable, and I remember thinking, this feels off." I hung up and stared at my phone for a long time. 8 months. How many moments had I dismissed because I trusted the narrative I was given? One night, I went out with coworkers for drinks. I drank more than I should have. A woman at the bar seemed interested in me. She gave me her number. I didn't use it, not because I was holding on to hope, but because I refused to let betrayal turn me into someone I didn't recognize. The month dragged on. I found out through mutual friends that my husband had moved into a short-term rental nearby, that he'd been calling in sick to work, that his parents were checking on him daily. I felt numb. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just hollow. My STD test came back negative. I assumed his did too. When the month ended, he asked if we could meet again. I agreed, on my terms. My lawyer advised me I couldn't legally stop him from accessing his belongings, so I told him he could come by while I was at the gym and be gone by a certain time. When I got home, his car was still in the driveway. Inside, the house smelled like food. He had cleaned the entire downstairs. He was chopping vegetables like he still lived there, like nothing had changed. He was dressed carefully, groomed, familiar. I told him to leave. He asked to talk. We sat at the kitchen table. I recorded again. He admitted the cab story was a lie, admitted that he knew something might happen when he went upstairs, and went anyway. Then he said something that finally snapped whatever softness I had left. He said he'd liked the attention, that being desired had felt good. Later, when words failed him, he tried something else. He offered to do anything to make me happy. Anything. He suggested things we used to talk about in private, things that once belonged only to us. He said he'd even be open to involving other people. He thought sex could undo betrayal. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so deeply wrong, it was almost absurd. When he tried to touch me, my body recoiled before my mind could respond. I told him to leave, for good. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him to file. Something shifted after that. Not relief exactly, but certainty. And certainty, I learned, can be just as heavy as grief. After that day, the house felt empty in a way I hadn't imagined possible. It wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the absence of trust, the absence of certainty, the absence of the life I thought I had built. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces that had once been familiar. The kitchen counter where we'd sipped morning coffee, the couch where we'd watched movies and argued over trivial things, the bed where we'd held each other through sleepless nights. Everything was the same, and yet completely alien. I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. My mind replayed every detail of the past month, every lie, every omission. I thought about how he had gone to Jaden's apartment, how he had kissed him, how he had believed attention and desire could overwrite years of commitment. I thought about the cab story, the diner, the partial truths, the evasions, the excuses. Every memory became a reminder that I had been naive, trusting someone who no longer deserved it. I felt a profound loneliness, a sensation that went beyond being alone. I was surrounded by walls, by furniture, by my own belongings, but I was completely isolated from the person I had thought I knew best. I remembered the first time I had met Jaden at Everly's birthday party, laughing and joking, seemingly harmless. Now, every interaction I'd had with him, every friendly smile, every "how's work," felt like a thread I'd been blindly holding, leading me to this inevitable end. The thought of having spent over a decade believing in something that had been hollow in critical places hit me like a physical blow. I questioned myself, my judgment, my instincts, my ability to see reality clearly. How had I missed the signs? How had I trusted so completely? Every small argument we'd ever had, every distant phone call, every unexplained night away, suddenly they seemed loaded with meaning I had ignored. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind would spin. The apartment, the bed, the kisses, the lies. I would get up, walk through the house, and stare at the walls, hoping that somehow the physical reality would anchor me when the emotional one had gone rogue. I cried quietly at first, then in broken sobs that made my chest burn, tears soaking my pillow. But grief was only part of it. Anger surged through me like electricity, rage at him for his choices, at Jaden for his intrusion into my life, at myself for the blind trust that allowed it to happen. I also felt guilt, not for what had happened, but for letting myself be vulnerable to someone who had repeatedly proven he could betray me, for thinking that commitment and love alone could shield me from betrayal. I replayed our conversations, every reassurance he had given me, every promise that now felt meaningless. The more I thought, the more suffocating the silence became. And in that crushing solitude, I realized I had hit rock bottom. There was no comfort, no safe space, no person who could undo the damage. Not even the truth, not even confrontation, not even clarity could erase what had been done. The house, the marriage, the trust, they were gone. For a moment, I felt like giving up entirely, walking away from everything without thought, without care, leaving the pieces for someone else to sort. But in that darkness, beneath the exhaustion, the anger, and the grief, there was a flicker, a small, stubborn ember that refused to die. It whispered a truth I had avoided. I couldn't control what he had done, but I could control what I did next. I could choose who I wanted to be after this. I could choose to survive, to reclaim my life, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind. But before I could act, I had to face the emptiness fully, to feel it, to acknowledge it, to let it crush me, if only briefly, before I could rebuild. Because hitting rock bottom doesn't feel like a turning point, it feels like the end. But sometimes, only from the deepest darkness can you find the path to the light. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't cinematic. There was no moment when the clouds parted and I suddenly felt empowered. No, it began quietly, like the first slow stirrings of a storm beneath the calm. 3 weeks after I had told him I wanted a month of no contact, I was going through old photos on my computer. Pictures from Everly's birthday party 8 years ago, the night Jaden first seemed to take notice of him. I lingered on one photo for far longer than I should have. There he was, leaning toward him, smiling like he was the only person in the room, completely unaware I was watching. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. He had always been a presence in my life, small but insistent, and I had let him occupy space in my marriage without thinking twice. It was that photo, strangely enough, that made the first piece of the turning point click into place. I realized I had been giving power away, letting the betrayal dictate my emotions, letting the lies and deceit haunt every corner of my mind. The anger, the grief, the sleepless nights, they had all been reactive. Now it was time to be proactive. I pulled out the email he had sent detailing the night with Jaden. I hadn't read it since the first glance. I opened it slowly, deliberately. Not because I wanted closure from him, he had already destroyed that, but because I wanted clarity for myself. Each line, each admission, no matter how humiliating, was a record, proof of the reality. And proof is a powerful thing. It doesn't plead, it doesn't manipulate, it just is. I started making lists, not of what he had done wrong, but of what I needed to do to reclaim my life. Financial security, personal space, emotional boundaries. I moved our joint accounts, documented everything meticulously. I called the lawyer I had already consulted and set up a meeting to discuss the divorce process in detail. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was steering the narrative instead of reacting to it. Then came a call from Everly. She had been my friend for years, loyal and honest. I asked her to come over. Together, we went through timelines, cross-checked stories, confirmed what had actually happened. She was blunt, fearless, a voice of truth in the fog of lies. "I think you've been underestimating yourself," she said. "You've spent so long protecting him emotionally that you forgot to protect yourself. That stops now." Her words hit harder than any confrontation with him ever could. Because it wasn't about anger, it wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, about recognizing my value, about understanding that betrayal is not a reflection of my worth. It's a reflection of his choices. I spent that evening alone, thinking. Not obsessing over what was lost, but visualizing what I wanted next. I imagined a life where I didn't have to question my partner's honesty, a life where I could trust my instincts and feel safe in my own home. I imagined the freedom that would come with reclaiming the power he had tried to take from me. By the time I went to bed, I had made a decision. I would move forward with the divorce, not in haste, not in anger, but with purpose. I would not let him manipulate my emotions any longer. I would take control of my life, my narrative, my heart. That night, I felt the first spark of what it truly meant to be free. Not freedom from him, not yet, but freedom from the paralysis his betrayal had created. I finally understood that the power I had been searching for outside of myself had always been inside me. I would rebuild, I would reclaim, I would rise, not because I had to, but because I deserved it. The weeks after my decision were surreal. It was as if a storm had passed, leaving devastation in its wake, but also a strange clarity in the air. I filed for divorce. The process was meticulous. I documented every interaction, every discrepancy, every lie. I moved money, finalized legal consultations, and prepared to reclaim the life that had been fractured. Each step was deliberate, careful. No impulsive decisions, no emotional outbursts. I wasn't doing it to punish him. I was doing it for myself. The fallout began quietly, then accelerated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Mutual friends started to drift away, not in malice, but in discomfort. People who had once offered sympathy to him were suddenly distant when they realized I had been the one wronged. Those who had attempted to defend his actions vanished. The social sphere we shared, once a network of laughter and shared dinners, became hollow. Even his family began to shift. His parents, who had called initially to plead on his behalf, started pulling back as the truth of his choices became undeniable. Visits became less frequent, phone calls shorter, the warmth replaced by polite distance. His world, built around a foundation of trust and image, was crumbling quietly, but visibly. I moved through it all with a strange mix of detachment and resolve. When I walked past our once shared spaces, the kitchen where arguments had seemed trivial, the living room where evenings had felt secure, I no longer felt pain in the familiar, only affirmation of the choice I had made. This was not loss. This was reclaiming what had been taken. Then there were the possessions. The house, once a symbol of shared dreams, became a logistical challenge. We sold it, dividing assets as evenly as possible to avoid long, drawn-out disputes. Each object, each piece of furniture, each appliance was cataloged, transferred, or replaced. But while the material items were divided, the intangible weight of betrayal remained mine to process. In the midst of the legal and practical aftermath, I began to notice changes in him. The arrogance and entitlement he had once carried like a shield were gone. Apologies came not in forceful attempts to manipulate, but in quiet, resigned tones. He no longer demanded, he no longer bargained. His friends and family saw him for what he had done, and he began to experience the isolation he had inflicted upon me. For me, life began to expand into spaces that had been closed off by his actions. I focused on myself, on my career, on passions that had taken a backseat for years. Weekends once reserved for passive reconciliation became active exploration. Basketball leagues, long runs, friends I had neglected, hobbies I had abandoned. There was a sense of lightness, tempered by the residual ache of betrayal, but also a growing strength that was undeniable. One afternoon, I met with him for the final practical exchange: keys, documents, remaining belongings. It was quiet, structured. almost mundane. There was no anger in me, no need for confrontation. I realized that revenge, humiliation, or extended conflict would not restore me. I had already reclaimed the most important things: my dignity, my autonomy, and my peace of mind. He asked softly if we could ever be friends. I shook my head, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Some bridges, once burned, cannot and should not be rebuilt. Not yet, not ever, perhaps. The chapters of our lives had diverged irrevocably, and I was determined to walk my path fully conscious of my worth. The fallout was complete. His social standing, the networks he relied upon, and even his own self-image had shifted. I didn't have to act against him. Life had delivered its own reckoning. Meanwhile, I moved forward, step by step, embracing both the grief and the liberation. Each day became a testament to resilience, a quiet proof that even after betrayal and deception, one could rise with grace and determination. By the time the house sold and the final papers were signed, I was no longer just surviving. I was building something new. Not out of vengeance, not out of bitterness, but from the strength born of clarity, truth, and the decision to prioritize myself above all else. The divorce was finalized. The legal papers signed, the house sold, the duffel bags of memories long gone. And yet for the first time in months, I felt a calm I hadn't known I could claim. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. I walked into my new apartment for the first time, smaller than the house we once shared, but filled with light and quiet, and it felt like a fresh canvas. Every corner belonged to me, every wall reflected my choices, and every room whispered that I had survived. The betrayal, the lies, the hours of sleepless nights, they had not destroyed me. They had sharpened me. I spent time reconnecting with friends I had neglected, pursuing hobbies I had set aside, and simply learning to be alone without fear. I ran. I played basketball again. I cooked. I laughed. Each day was small, deliberate proof that life could continue, stronger, more intentional, more authentic. I thought often about trust, about love, about the kind of honesty that sustains a relationship versus the deceit that erodes it from the inside. I realized that forgiveness is not always about reconciliation. Sometimes it is about releasing yourself from the expectation that someone else's choices should dictate your worth. And so I let go. I did not seek revenge. I did not harbor bitterness. I allowed the truth to be the reckoning. He faced the consequences of his choices in his own life, the fractured relationships, the loss of trust, the isolation. I did not need to act. The fallout had already unfolded naturally. The lesson I understood was not just about him. It was about me, about knowing my limits, honoring my value, and refusing to settle for less than honesty and respect. I learned that empowerment doesn't always roar. It sometimes comes quietly, in the decision to walk away, in the choice to reclaim your life piece by piece, in the courage to start again. As I looked out my apartment window, the city stretching wide before me, I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't known in years. The past could not be erased, but it did not have to define me. I was whole, I was capable, I was free, and in that freedom, I found the strength to believe in life after betrayal. Not just survival, but growth, self-respect, and hope. This is what I want anyone going through something similar to understand. Betrayal will hurt. Lies will shatter your world. But the strength to rise is already within you. Protect your heart. Trust your instincts. And never forget that walking away is not failure. It is courage.